Emily Mkrtichian, we are talking to you today about your tremendous documentary, There Was Not. Come to find out, it is an Armenian phrase when you start a story. I love that's how you started the film. Uh, Artsakh, the situation in Artsakh is a mirror of what happened in 1915. You being Armenian, me being Assyrian, we suffered the same fate at the hand of the Turks.
Mm-mm.
They're going to complain and say it didn't happen, and we know it did. Um, when you decide to make a documentary like this, going into a war zone and understanding, like from a Western perspective, they're like, how can you go there? And then you feature the families and are like, how are people still, like Sosi practicing judo, and then the family and worrying about the son if he's going to actually go fight, and just various different lifestyles, but people still living their lives. A Western perspective isn't really going to understand how can you go still live your life in the middle of a war zone and not shelter, and hide from everything rather.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, when I started making this film, we had years of peace, and I think there's something about that kind of like Western mindset or Western media that you're talking about that's kind of characterizes this place as just always stuck in some sort of conflict, when really it was this vibrant, beautiful place where like people knew how to live. So I was really lucky to have 4 years of just being in the place and appreciating the land and the people and the way of life and documenting kind of the joy that took place there before the war broke out in 2020, which was a big surprise to us all. And of course, yeah, it was a coincidence that I happened to be there with a camera. It's not something I ever expected to see or experience in my lifetime. And the film itself is kind of a way to process how do you even begin to understand or tell a story about an event like this?
You know, the surprising part is how it all began and how unexpected it was. But money and politics are hand in hand. And when you get one financier pushing for something, something else is going to happen. Um, Being witness to it and seeing how not only did it affect you being Armenian in Artsakh, but also the people that were the subject matter and the people that you got to meet along the way. How do you remove yourself as being an active participant because you're living this experience and now pull back and become the filmmaker? So going from close up to wide shot.
Yeah, I mean, it was a years long process and it was incredibly difficult. And ultimately, I think when you watch the film, part of what it wants to convey is that there isn't a separation always. Part of the process of making this film was very personal, and it was about processing generational trauma, processing trauma in our own lifetimes. It's about how to bear witness and tell a story. So, obviously, I think that that doesn't mean that you can't be a good filmmaker focused on craft. I think for me, the stories that I'm drawn to are always, they have the seed of something personal in them. Like, I want to know why the filmmaker wanted to be a part of that community and reflect it or represent it as a story to the rest of the world. And part of like my political, ethical approach to filmmaking is that I include that in the story itself.
You did a tremendous job with the film. And as you can see, I'm trying not to give too much away because we want them to see it first in New York on October 10th, and then in LA the week after. When we want to know your mindset, obviously, and that's something that you enjoy incorporating into the film because you are still a part of it. You're not an outsider looking in. You're very much in the heart of the situation. Um, in dealing with something like this, at what point do you put the camera down and run? At what point do you pick up the camera and go, "Oh, this is going to make a great shot"? Because there is that dichotomy of safety versus journalism.
Yeah, so something about like documenting an active conflict that was like new and unexpected to me was kind of that dynamic of navigating safety concerns But one thing that happened when the war broke out is that all of a sudden there were hundreds of people from international media outlets there for just a few days who were telling the story. And they were running towards the bombs and the explosions and trying to get to the front lines. And so it really felt like my work as someone who had already been there for years and had these like deeply embedded relationships was to turn my camera towards what they were completely ignoring, which was the effect that this was happening, that this was having on like real people and especially women who had lived their whole lives in this place. So I made a really conscious choice that my camera was going to be more concerned with the emotional journeys of these four women who we'd gotten to know for years, than it was with the actual dropping of bombs, which is something that you could always get footage of later. Like it's always possible to license all the stock footage that these journalists were recording because they had these kind of like repeatable images, these images that we see every day now on our cell phone screens. But I think what's more important, what we don't get access to, is the real stories of real people and what it feels like for them.
Right. And it's also interesting talking to the older generation, even our parents' generation, the ones that survived communism that was in Armenia and Azerbaijan and the Eastern Bloc to now, 35 years later, it's only 35 years to come and like, here's another situation that's uprising, and here's another situation that everybody's dealing with.
Mm,
When you revisit their stories in that regard of, the end of communism to what we've developed to now going into a war, how does that reflect on their psyche? Because you use the term generational trauma, that's still embedded in who they are as a single person, not even going to the next generation or the previous one.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's also to think even, it's important to think even more widely about it, which is that this is a place that's kind of at the crossroads of empires. It was part of the Persian Empire that fell. It was part of the Ottoman Empire that fell. Then it had a few years of independence, and there was the Soviet Union. So these are cultures and peoples who have seen a lot of different types of rises and falls, and kind of, in a sense, like that. I think, this beginning to every fairy tale that there was not, is a way of acknowledging that. It's the same kind of formulation in Persian, in Arabic. I don't know if you say a similar thing in Assyrian, but there's like an acknowledgement that what was is temporary. There was and there was not. And I'm going to tell you a story about it to keep it alive. But
Right.
did it happen or did it not happen?
It's interesting in how all of this develops. I'll give you a personal anecdote. My cousin in Beirut, I got to talk to him a couple of days after the pier blew up.
Hmm.
And I was talking to my cousin George. I said, "Are you okay?" He said, "Yeah, we're fine. The window stopped blowing out about 3 blocks ago. So we have
Mm,
nothing to worry about." So
mm,
it almost has become that level of indifference because so used to something. And here we
hmm,
are 5 years removed from when the war started. And it's kind of fallen to the wayside of, okay, this isn't the hot topic right now. We got two other fronts that we're facing. You know, how are the people now dealing with it 5 years later after all of this began? And how has the mindset shifted in comparison to, oh, this could be over in a couple of days to where we are now?
mm. Yeah. I mean, I think it's first like really important to say that, especially in this region, it's important to see these conflicts as like part and parcel of the same history. So when we talk about solidarity, like from this region, like when you talk to me about what happened to your ancestors and what happened to my ancestors, I'm like, we're not in competition, we're in solidarity,
Right.
right? Like we understand the nature of these events. So I think that's one way of thinking about it and dealing with it. As far as like, especially the four women in the film, I can see this like in the history of my own family as well. Everyone has kind of dealt with it in a different way. I think there's kind of a spectrum between, are we living in the past and living for the past? Are we looking towards the future and living for that? Or are we like really squarely here in the present and trying to adapt to the real circumstances? Um, like, so say, for example, she she is just waiting to go back to Artsakh, you know? She's not trying to adapt to where she is. Like she wants to go back to her home. And there's like a real resistance and strength in that, but she's also not able to live in the present where she is. Siranush has gone on to become a journalist. She's now doing a international human rights defense program in Lisbon. And she's like really looking towards the future and what comes next and how to build something new. And Diane is like really in the present. She's working with people who are displaced. She's working with refugees to find them services, housing, work, all those kinds of things. And so I think it really depends on the person and the way that they're kind of dealing with this trauma of losing a home.
Right. It's just so fascinating, the human mindset, because you could be in the same house and have a different experience, even though you're sitting with your sibling and they share the same exact moment that you did. Um,
Yeah.
in seeing what these four women went through and, longing for what was versus what is or what will be, it's interesting to see how these mindsets change the person themselves. And you capture their own personal stories without either diminishing their light or hyper focusing on them. You just let them be. And I think as a filmmaker and especially as a documentarian, that has become very rare today. It's not the
Mm.
sense of, and I use this example between the two of them, Michael Moore on the left and then Matt Walsh on the right. Here's my agenda, and I'm going to go find the story that fits my agenda. You just
Mhm.
told a story of what was, and that's what's most appreciative of it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think part of that is just engaging in real relationships with real people. And, it's so important to allow the people who are being vulnerable and putting themselves in front of a camera to have some autonomy in what the story that's being told about them is. And I think a lot of that is like being very honest with the footage that you have and staying open and curious to what it might want to tell you and what they're really saying to you, not just how it might fit an argument. And in reality, those are the most interesting and engaging stories because they are a direct mirror of the complicated nature of our reality. They don't offer any easy answers or simplistic solutions or people who are kind of flattened to mean one thing. These women are deeply complex and complicated, like each one of us. And that's, I think, what's interesting about them as characters.
Yeah, Emily, you've been in several film festivals. You've won quite a few of them for Best Documentary. When you get to sit there and now get the release, because so many films have been recognized on the film festival circuit and then are kind of forgotten about when it comes time for distribution. To get the distribution and now touring it around, I mean, the 10th is going to be in New York. Uh, excuse me. The release first goes to New York on the 10th, then it's coming to Los Angeles, and eventually making the way around Southern California and through the country. How exciting is that the recognition is finally there and going good? People are going to wake up and be able to see this film.
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult time for independent film, for art house creative work. And I feel absolutely like honored and privileged to be able to bring this film to more people. Um, I think that in New York and LA, LA especially, that's like, there's a huge Armenian population there. And when this like real life historical event happened 5 years ago, there was so much, like you mentioned, like it was kind of a blip on the scene. And there's so many people who didn't know about it. So for both groups, I've had so many screenings where people come up to me afterwards and they're like, wow, I've just never heard of this. I never heard of this conflict. So to be able to share that story and have it recognized by people who might not have ever heard of it, and then also bring it home to like the community of Armenians and like people from the region. You know, the film is being released by Watermelon. They're Palestinian owned. They're the only Arab-owned company, distribution company in the US. And to like bring it to that community is so deeply special. And the screenings that I've been able to do in those communities, there's this kind of sense of catharsis of like, we've been trying, it's too painful to think about these things, but to come to a theater and sit together and watch it happen and also celebrate the joy of this place and then be in conversation afterward, it's a really special thing.
Is there one conversation following the screening where obviously you're doing the Q&A at a few of these, but we get in the car, we're going home with our friends or family that we saw the film in person, or we're even hanging out in the lobby talking to strangers. What's one conversation you would like people to have after seeing this film?
I think one conversation I really want people to have is like, wow, what a beautiful place. Let's remember it like that. I think again, there's kind of been a reduction of this place to a war zone that just doesn't do it justice. And that place and the people who lived there, there was just such beauty and joy. And I want us to be able to remember and celebrate that because, in my mind, that's how we resist the erasure that's happening now of what was there. And to remember it with love and joy is especially potent and important.
Emily, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it. I can't believe you whittled this down to 94 minutes. There was not a phenomenal documentary. We will link to where the screenings are going to be in the post. Where can we find you and the film on social media if we want to keep the conversation going?
I'm at Emily Mkrtichian, and the film is There Was Not Film.